Why does God let bad things happen? Chapter 1. How could a good God allow so much suffering? Right now, at this very moment, all around the world, things are going wrong. Bad news is everywhere, and it comes in all shapes and sizes. Some problems are pretty easy to solve. The littlest kids at the school where I work come to me with heaps of problems, but to be honest, most of them aren't that big of a deal. I can usually fix them with a band-aid or by telling them to go get a drink of water or to pick someone different to play with. But as we get older, our problems often get more complicated. If you came to me for advice about a crisis you were having with a friend and my solution was go get a drink of water, I'm guessing you wouldn't come back to me for advice anytime soon. Real life is too complicated for easy answers. Chris, can I tell you something? The girl's eyes flashed around the room at the other kids to make sure they wouldn't overhear, and she sighed like her heart was breaking. I don't think my mum and dad are ever going to love each other again. She looked miserable, obviously, but more than that, she looked exhausted, like all that sadness had worn her out. A few weeks later, it was official. Her dad had packed up and moved out. When I asked how she was feeling about it all, she stared at the ground for a long time. At least I won't have to listen to them yell at each other anymore. I first met Allegra when she was 5 years old, on her very first day of school. Allegra was this fun, thoughtful, big-hearted kid, the kind of person who was always way more interested in paying attention to other people than trying to make them pay attention to her. And even though, as one of her teachers, I'd been told that Allegra was recovering from brain surgery and still had a bunch of medical stuff going on, you never would have guessed it by how enthusiastic she always was about school. But then, one day, Allegra didn't come back to school. And as the days went on, we got the news that she wouldn't be coming back to school. Allegra's cancer was back, and this time it wasn't going away. Not long after her 6th birthday, I found myself standing in a crowded church, surrounded by the hundreds of other friends and family who had gathered for Allegra's funeral. As we prayed and hugged and cried and said goodbye, the same questions burned through my mind over and over again. God, how could you let this happen? Don't you care? If you've picked up this book, maybe that's your question too. Maybe you're going through something awful and heartbreaking yourself, or maybe someone you love is. Or maybe it's just that the constant stream of horrible stuff on the news is making you feel anxious and scared about the world and you don't know how to make sense of it all. Maybe you wonder where God is in the middle of all this. When you think about it, all this hurt and brokenness in the world seems like a pretty big problem for God, or at least it seems like a pretty big problem for us if we want to believe what God says about himself in the Bible, in particular that he's all-loving and all-powerful. Because if God truly is all-loving, then surely he'd want to stop all the suffering that's going on in the world, right? And if he truly is all-powerful, then he could stop all that suffering whenever he wanted to. But he hasn't. The world is still full of suffering. So why doesn't God do something? Is God not actually as strong as he says he is? Does he want to stop our suffering, but he's too weak to do it? Or worse, is he not actually as loving as he says he is? Is he powerful enough to stop our suffering, but too cruel to do it? Or is he both? Is God weak and cruel? Or is all this suffering just proof that God's not really there at all? Like I said, suffering seems like a pretty big problem for God. Here's the thing though. If your biggest question is how could a loving, powerful God allow so much suffering, there's actually a really easy answer. The whole reason why people ask God for help in the first place and blame him when he doesn't seem to give it to them is that God is meant to be so much bigger and wiser and more loving and more powerful than we are. But if that's true, if God really is that much bigger and wiser than us, then couldn't he have all kinds of good and loving reasons for letting our suffering continue, but which are just too big for us to see right now? Just because we can't see a good reason for our suffering, that doesn't mean there isn't one. If God is big enough to blame for our suffering, he must also be big enough to have great reasons for allowing our suffering to continue that we just don't understand yet. So there you go. There's your answer to the problem of suffering. And I actually think it's a great, solid answer, but if you're anything like me, it probably doesn't feel very helpful. Because what I've just given you is a tidy little head answer. But suffering isn't just a puzzle for our heads. It's a problem for our hearts. When we're actually going through something awful, I don't think our biggest question is, how could a loving, powerful God allow so much suffering? When it feels like life is falling apart, the cry of our hearts is something bigger and deeper and way more personal. God, how could you let this happen? Don't you care? If we're going to believe that God is as loving and powerful as he says he is, that's the question we really need to answer. And that bigger, deeper, way more personal question is what this book is all about. That was chapter 1 of my new book, Why Does God Let Bad Things Happen?, which is part of the Big Questions series. Wow, look at this subtle product placement. I'm a pro YouTuber, you guys. What can I say? Anyway, I'll put some links in the description, so if you want to pick up a copy, you can. And also, if you want to hear me read the first chapters of the other 2 books, you can do that here.